They call it the American dream, but nobody tells you that dreams are only possible when you're asleep. My name is Riley, and 3 weeks ago, I moved into a house that looked like a postcard from the 1950s. Silver Spring, Maryland, a place where the lawns are manicured with surgical precision, and the neighbors wave at you with a synchronized stiffness that feels rehearsed. I'm a freelance editor, so I spend most of my time behind a screen, watching the world through a window. For the first few days, it was peaceful. Too peaceful. You know that frequency of silence that's so loud it makes your ears ring? That's Silver Spring. No sirens, no barking dogs, just the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of the oak trees. It felt like living inside a Tupperware container, perfectly preserved, airtight, and completely devoid of life. My house is a charming colonial on Oakridge Lane. White siding, a dark blue door, and a porch swing that creaks in a minor key. On my first night, my neighbor, a man named Mr. Henderson, who looks like every retired CIA agent you've ever seen in a movie, brought over an apple pie. He didn't step inside. He just stood on the porch, his eyes hidden behind aviator sunglasses, even though it was overcast, and told me one thing. Not, welcome to the neighborhood. Not, let me know if you need anything. He looked at my front door lock and said, "In Silver Spring, we value our privacy, Riley. If you hear something at night, just remember, it's probably just the wind in the Maryland pines. Don't go looking for trouble, and trouble won't look for you." I laughed it off. I thought it was just quirky small-town advice. But then came the fourth night. It was 3:14 a.m. I was in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, the only light coming from the glowing blue LED of the microwave. The house was dead quiet, and then I heard it. A sound so sharp, so visceral, it bypassed my brain and went straight to my spinal cord. A child crying. It wasn't a muffled sound from a neighbor's house. It was right there, on my porch. Just inches away from where I stood, separated only by 2 inches of wood and a deadbolt. It was a rhythmic, sobbing wail, the kind a toddler makes when they're lost and terrified. "Mommy?" A tiny wavering voice gasped between the sobs. My first instinct was to throw the door open. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing the cold metal. But then I stopped. I'm an editor. I spend 10 hours a day listening to audio tracks, trimming dead air, spotting loops. And as I listened to that crying, something felt mechanical. There was a specific crackle at the end of every intake of breath. A tiny millisecond-long pop of static that shouldn't be there in a human throat. I stood frozen, holding my breath, counting the seconds. 45 seconds of crying, a sharp intake of air, a sob. "Mommy?" Then a pause. And then, at exactly the 45-second mark, the sequence started again, identical, to the microbeat. It wasn't a child. It was a recording. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see a teenager with a boombox or a cruel prankster, but the porch was empty. The street lamp across the road flickered, illuminating the driveway, the empty swing, and the perfectly trimmed hedges. There was nobody there, yet the crying continued louder now, vibrating the very frame of the door. It felt like the sound wasn't coming from the air, but from the walls themselves. That was the moment I realized Mr. Henderson wasn't being neighborly. He was giving me a survival guide, and as I backed away into the darkness of my hallway, I saw a black SUV idling at the end of the cul-de-sac with its headlights off, just sitting there, watching my house, waiting to see if I would turn the handle. The next morning, Silver Spring looked like a scene from a detergent commercial. The sun was hitting the dew-covered lawns of Oakridge Lane, and the air smelled of freshly cut grass and expensive mulch. It was almost enough to make me believe that the 3 a.m. crying was a hallucination, a glitch in my sleep-deprived brain. Almost. But then I looked at my front door. Near the bottom of the frame, right where the wood meets the porch, I saw a thin, oily residue. A smudge that looked like it had been left by a suction cup or a high-powered microphone. I didn't go to my neighbor's house for answers. Instead, I grabbed a pair of garden shears and headed for the backyard. My house is bordered by a thick line of Maryland oaks and overgrown ivy, the kind of foliage that looks aesthetic in the spring but feels suffocating in the dark. I started at the perimeter. I was looking for anything, a wire, a hidden camera, a sign of a prankster. But as I pushed through the heavy branches of an old weeping willow near the property line, I tripped over something hard. It wasn't a rock. It was a metal casing, half buried in the dirt and camouflaged with dull green spray paint. I knelt down, my heart beginning that familiar, erratic thumping. It was a loudspeaker, but not a consumer-grade one. This was heavy, industrial, with a serial number etched into the side, USG-BIO-772-S. Beneath it, in faded white lettering, were the words, Property of Maryland Research and Development Division, do not remove. My breath hitched. I'm an American. I grew up hearing stories about MK Ultra and the Tuskegee experiments. We live in a country where conspiracy theory is often just a spoiler for the 6 o'clock news 6 months later. I live 20 minutes away from Fort Meade, the headquarters of the NSA. In this part of Maryland, the government isn't some abstract concept. It's the guy living next door who never talks about his job. I pulled out my phone and tried to search for the serial number. The signal bar was full, but the page wouldn't load. Connection timed out. I tried again. Same result. I switched to cellular data, nothing. It was as if my house had become a digital black hole. That's when I saw her. A woman across the street, Mrs. Gable. She was standing in her driveway holding a garden hose, but the water was just running into the gutter. She wasn't washing her car. She was staring at me. Her face was a mask of polite suburban indifference. But her eyes, they were tracking my every move with the cold precision of a security camera. Found something interesting, Riley? She called out, her voice unnervingly cheerful. Just some old junk in the ivy, Mrs. Gable, I yelled back, trying to keep my voice steady. I shoved the speaker back under the leaves. Be careful with the junk around here, she said, and for a split second, the mask slipped. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. The soil in Silver Spring has a way of reacting to things that don't belong. You should come over for tea tonight. We're having a neighborhood meeting to discuss the local acoustics. I didn't answer. I went back inside and locked the door, deadbolt, chain, and the heavy security bar I'd bought at Home Depot that morning. I sat in my office and opened my laptop. I didn't need the internet. I had a backup drive of my previous work. I'm an editor, and 2 years ago, I worked on a documentary about acoustic weapons, the Havana Syndrome, and LRAD devices. I remembered a footnote in one of the declassified files about something called Project Serenade. I found the file. It was a scanned PDF from 1994, heavily redacted. The project wasn't about weapons that kill. It was about social stabilization through bio-acoustic triggering. The theory was simple and terrifying. Humans are biologically hardwired to respond to the sound of a distressed infant. It triggers a spike in cortisol and an immediate rescue response. If you can broadcast that sound at a specific frequency, you can bypass a person's rational mind. You can make them open their doors. You can make them leave their homes in a state of panic. You can lead them wherever you want. According to the file, the testing phase required a controlled, high-density residential environment, a place where people were isolated enough to be vulnerable, but close enough to be monitored. I looked out my window at the rows of identical houses, the perfect neighborhood, the perfect American suburb. It wasn't a community, it was a petri dish. The crying hadn't been a prank. It was a call. They were testing the signal on me, the new resident, the variable they hadn't yet calibrated. Suddenly, my house phone rang. It was a landline I hadn't even set up yet. The previous owners had left the hardware in the kitchen. I didn't want to pick it up, but the ringing was insistent, rhythmic, echoing through the empty house. I walked to the kitchen and lifted the receiver. For the first 5 seconds, there was only static. Then a voice. It wasn't Mrs. Gable, and it wasn't Mr. Henderson. It was my own voice. A recording of me from 3 minutes ago saying, "Just some old junk in the ivy, Mrs. Gable." The recording played back, but it was slowed down, distorted, layered over the sound of that same crying child. And then a man's voice, deep, monotone, and professional, spoke over the noise. Subject 44B has identified the hardware. Initiation of Phase 2, sleep deprivation and cognitive stress. Increase the frequency of the lullaby signal by 15 decibels. And Riley? The voice paused. Make sure you check the vents. The air in Silver Spring is very heavy tonight. The air in my house didn't just feel heavy, it felt electric. You know that sensation right before a massive lightning strike? When the hair on your arm stands up and the oxygen seems to vanish? That was my living room at 10 p.m. I had spent the last 4 hours systematically taping over every air vent in the house with heavy-duty silver duct tape. If Project Serenade was using aerosolized tranquilizers or psychoactive gas to supplement the acoustic triggers, I wasn't going to make it easy for them. I sat in the middle of the kitchen floor, the only room without a direct view of the street, clutching a tactical flashlight and a kitchen knife that felt pathetic against the weight of a government-backed conspiracy. The sun had set over the Maryland suburbs, but the darkness wasn't natural. The street lamps on Oakridge Lane hadn't turned on. The entire cul-de-sac was a black void, save for the faint, rhythmic blinking of a red light atop a cell tower 3 miles away. Then the sound started. But it wasn't just the crying anymore. It began as a low-frequency hum, so deep I felt it in my molars before I heard it. It was an infrasound pulse, the kind they use to disperse riots or cause nausea in enemy combatants. And layered over that bone-shaking vibration was the lullaby. Wail. Sob. Mommy? Wail. Sob. Mommy? But this time, it wasn't coming from the porch. It was coming from the walls. It was coming from the pipes under the sink. It was coming from the microwave, the speakers of my powered-down laptop, and the dead landline on the counter. The entire house had been turned into one giant resonator. The sound was omnidirectional, a surround sound nightmare that stripped away my sense of balance. I checked my phone. 0% signal. I tried to restart it, but the screen just flickered with green binary code before turning white. Unauthorized access detected. Device locked by administrative protocol. They weren't just testing me anymore. They were harvesting. I heard a heavy thud on the roof, then another. It sounded like footsteps, but too heavy, too deliberate. I looked up at the ceiling, watching the plaster dust shake loose with every impact. Someone or something was pacing directly above me. Riley, a voice whispered. It didn't come from the vents. It came from the baby monitor I had found in the attic earlier that day and left on the kitchen table. It was Mr. Henderson's voice, but it was stripped of its suburban politeness. It sounded like a recording being played through a distorted filter. The neighborhood meeting has begun, Riley. You're late. The lullaby is for the children, but the protocol is for the residents who don't sleep. You're a high-functioning outlier. You see the loops, you hear the static. That makes you a valuable data point, or a liability. I didn't wait for him to finish. I grabbed my car keys and my jacket. I had to get to the I-95. If I could just reach the state police barracks in Jessup, maybe I could find someone who wasn't on the payroll of whatever Maryland Research Development actually was. I ran to the garage, my footsteps echoing in the hollow house. I hit the button for the garage door. Nothing. The power was cut. I grabbed the manual release cord and pulled. The heavy metal door screeched open, revealing the pitch-black driveway. I jumped into my SUV and cranked the engine. It sputtered, choked, and died. I tried again. The dashboard lights flickered, and for a second, the GPS screen came to life. It didn't show a map of Silver Spring. It showed a grid of the neighborhood, with every house marked in red, except mine, which was flashing a brilliant, sickly violet. Target status, active, containment level, Delta. I looked out the windshield and saw them, the neighbors. Mrs. Gable was standing at the end of my driveway. Next to her was Mr. Henderson, still wearing his aviator sunglasses in the dead of night. Behind them stood 5 or 6 other residents I'd seen at the grocery store or jogging past my house. They were all standing perfectly still, spaced exactly 6 feet apart, forming a human semicircle around my garage. They weren't shouting, they weren't moving, they were just listening. Then, as if on a silent command, they all tilted their heads to the left at the exact same angle. From their pockets, they pulled out small handheld devices that glowed with a pale blue light. The crying sound shifted. It stopped being a child. It turned into a high-pitched metallic shriek, a frequency so sharp it shattered the windows of my garage. Shards of glass rained down on the car. I screamed, covering my ears, feeling a warm trickle of blood run down my neck. "Open the door, Riley," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice wasn't coming from her mouth, It was being broadcast from the speakers of my own car. The experiment requires a baseline of compliance. Don't make us increase the amplitude. I looked at the back of the garage. There was a small pedestrian door leading to the side yard, hidden behind a stack of moving boxes. It was my only shot. I lunged out of the car, staying low. I kicked the side door open and sprinted into the darkness of the Maryland woods. I didn't follow the path. I ran through the thorns and the briars, the sound of the lullaby chasing me through the trees like a physical entity. As I reached the edge of the woods, where the suburbs meet the state park, I saw something that stopped me dead. It wasn't a forest. It was a construction site. Hundreds of acres of trees that were actually cell towers disguised as pines. And in the center of the clearing stood a massive, windowless concrete building with the same logo I'd seen on the speaker. SG-BIO. A fleet of black SUVs sat idling in the parking lot. And there, standing by the main entrance, was a man in a lab coat holding a clipboard. He looked at his watch, then looked directly toward the tree line where I was hiding. Subject 44B has exited the primary containment zone, he said into a radio. Initiate the lost child broadcast on all external frequencies. Let's see how far she runs before her instinct brings her back to us. Suddenly, the woods around me erupted with sound. Not from one speaker, but from thousands. A chorus of 100 different children, all crying, all screaming for their mothers, all perfectly synced. I realized then that I wasn't running away from the experiment. I was just moving into a different phase of the map. The woods weren't woods. They were an architectural lie. As I sprinted through the artificial pines of the Maryland State Park, my hands were torn by needles that felt more like plastic than organic matter. Every tree I passed had a small recessed camera lens embedded in its trunk, tracking my thermal signature with a silent, mechanical whir. The chorus of 100 crying children wasn't just behind me anymore. It was beneath me. The very ground, covered in synthetic needles, seemed to vibrate with the frequency of 1,000 sobbing throats. I reached the perimeter fence, a 10-foot chain-link barrier topped with concertina wire that hummed with a low-voltage charge. Beyond it was the highway, the I-95, a vein of civilization that represented my only hope. I could see the distant headlights of long-haul truckers, oblivious to the Bio-Acoustic nightmare happening just yards away in the dark. I grabbed a fallen branch and shoved it into the fence, looking for a gap. But as I leaned against the metal, a voice exploded from a hidden speaker just inches from my ear. It wasn't a recording this time. It was live. "Riley, look at your hands," the voice commanded. It was the man in the lab coat from the concrete monolith. I looked. In the pale, artificial moonlight, my skin looked translucent. But it wasn't the light. Underneath my veins, there was a faint, rhythmic pulsing. A blue glow that matched the frequency of the lullaby signal. The apple pie Mr. Henderson brought? The air you've been breathing through those taped vents? It wasn't gas, Riley. It was a bioluminescent acoustic marker. You aren't just a subject, you've become an antenna. Your own nervous system is now tuned to the Silver Spring frequency. You can't leave, because the signal is you. I screamed, a raw, jagged sound that was immediately swallowed by the surrounding forest. I threw myself at the fence, ignoring the shocks of electricity that danced across my skin. I scrambled over the wire, tearing my jacket, my jeans, my flesh. I tumbled onto the gravel shoulder of the highway, gasping for air that tasted of diesel and freedom. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my bloodied arms at an oncoming Peterbilt truck. The driver slammed on his brakes. The air horns let out a deafening blast that briefly drowned out the crying in my head. "Help me," I sobbed as the driver climbed down from his cab. He was an older man, wearing a flannel shirt and a baseball cap. He looked concerned, reaching out a hand to steady me. "They're experimenting on us. Silver Spring. The Project Serenade. You have to call the FBI, the National Guard, anyone." The driver looked at me, then looked back at the dark line of trees I had just emerged from. He didn't look confused. He didn't look scared. He looked disappointed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handheld device, the same glow, the same pale blue light I had seen in Mrs. Gable's hand. "Sector 4 to command," he said into a shoulder-mounted radio. Subject 44B has achieved a physical breach of the perimeter, initiating the Hitchhiker Recovery Protocol. He looked back at me, his eyes devoid of empathy. You're a runner, Riley. We like the runners. They provide the best stress response data for the urban expansion phase. Did you really think the experiment stopped at the cul-de-sac? Silver Spring was just the calibration site. We've already wired the rest of the corridor. From Baltimore to DC, the lullaby is already in the walls. I backed away, my boots skidding on the asphalt. I looked down the long, dark stretch of the I-95. Every mile marker, every overhead sign, every emergency call box, they all had that same USG-BIO serial number etched into the metal. The entire infrastructure of the East Coast was humming. I realized then the true scale of the conspiracy. It wasn't about one neighborhood. It was about the Smart City Initiative, a world where the government doesn't need police to control a crowd. They just need to play a sound that triggers a biological necessity to obey. A world where a crying child is the ultimate lock and key for the human mind. I turned and ran across the highway, dodging a black SUV that had suddenly appeared from the service road. I dove into the bushes on the other side, heading for the suburbs of Laurel, Maryland. But as I reached the first row of houses in this new, safe neighborhood, I stopped. The street lamps were off. The lawns were perfectly manicured. And there, standing on a porch that looked exactly like mine, was a young woman. She was holding a glass of water, staring at her front door with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. And then I heard it, from the bushes behind her, from the storm drains beneath the street, from the very phone in my pocket. Wail. Sob. Mommy? I didn't try to warn her. I couldn't. My throat was tight, my vocal cords vibrating with a frequency I couldn't control. I opened my mouth to scream, but the only sound that came out was the perfect, high-pitched cry of a terrified 3-year-old. I wasn't Riley anymore. I was the broadcast. I sat down in the shadows of someone else's American dream and waited. I waited for her to touch the doorknob. I waited for the loop to start again. Because in Silver Spring and everywhere else the wires reach, the crying never stops. It just finds a new throat to call home,